Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
My name is Stephen Bowling, and I'm the president of the Prometheum Foundation. We believe democracy demands discussion, discourse, and debate. This evening, I'm thrilled to be having a constitutional conversation with Akhil Reed Amar, a sterling professor of law and political science at Yale University. And he is an incredibly accomplished, world-renowned scholar of the U.S. Constitution. The professor has been cited by Supreme Court justices in more than 4 cases. He regularly testifies before Congress at the invitation of both major parties, and his work has won awards from both the American Bar Association and the Federalist Society. He is the author of more than 100 law review articles and numerous books on the Constitution and its history. His newest book is The Words That Made Us: America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. Professor Amar has studied the subject for over 30 years. If you are interested in the Constitution and its history, I strongly recommend this book. It is a brilliant look with new insights at our constitutional journey. Even if you disagree with something Professor Amar writes, when he says it, you have to take it seriously and examine his reasoning, because he is probably correct. Let's give a big welcome to Professor Akhil Reed Amar. Akhil, thank you for being here.
Steve, thank you.
And we have some, a bunch of students here and also watching live online from AIT High School. And they're part of a group we do called the Franklin Forum, where they actually have constitutional conversations.
How cool.
So there's a bunch of budding scholars here.
And we're talking about that Franklin?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Ben.
A
All about the Benjamins.
A scholar is something that I am not, so you're going to have to excuse my ignorance on a lot of things. But I am curious, and like those students, I want to know more about the document I live under and better understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So you describe yourself as a person on the left end of the political spectrum.
Yeah,
and yet
left of center.
And yet you're an originalist.
Yes.
Why originalism? Why should I view the Constitution through an originalism focus?
So let me answer it 3 ways. Depends on who you are. Now, if you're a government official, because you took an oath to the thing, and you didn't have to, and maybe actually you could have said, oh, I'm going to take an oath, but before I take the oath, I'm going to tell everyone who votes for me that I'm going to have my fingers crossed when I take the oath. I don't really mean it's kind of like a play. I'm not really a Nazi. I just play one, in Saving Private Ryan or something like that. Okay, but no, if you're a government official, darn it, you took an oath to the thing. And it's to this Constitution, which is a text. And ordinarily, we kind of understand text by reference to what the people who were trying to do with words. If you and I are talking, and we make a contract or something, well, we'd want to know, well, what did we agree to in the contract? What those words mean to us, okay? So the Constitution's a text, and if you pledge allegiance to it, I think you'd want to know, what did it mean to the people who made that agreement? So that's if you're a government official. Now, if you're an American, my fellow Americans, I think you want to pay attention to it because it's the only thing we have in common. We don't have race. We don't have religion. We don't have even primary language. We don't have geography. America is vast. We don't have politics. We're very divided. So there are other countries in the world that maybe can get by because they have so much cultural identity. They are organized around a common sense of blood or faith or important texts. If you're German, maybe it's Goethe. If you're a Brit, maybe it's Shakespeare or something like that. We don't have that. And without the Constitution, frankly, we're Beirut, and that's not a nice place to be. So there's that. And that means it's harder for us than for other peoples in the world that have less, to use a word, diversity. Some of us, our families came yesterday. My family came here pretty recently. Some of us came hundreds of years ago, the families, some with bullwhips in their hands, some in chains. So what we have in common is the Constitution. So that's the second reason. And the story behind it. Ben Franklin, George Washington, the other big four in this book about the founding. By acclamation, they're your first four presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, plus Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton. And it's not just the text, but the people behind it. They're our national icons, our symbols. They're unifying. So there's that. Now, if you're someone in the rest of the world, you're not bound by this thing as an officer, you're not an American, well, you should pay attention to it because it's an astonishing achievement. Because more people at the founding got to vote on how they and their posterity would be governed than had ever been allowed to vote on anything before in the history of the planet Earth. That's what the preamble actually says, even though you often kind of miss that. We, the people, for various reasons we can talk about, do ordain and establish things. They actually did something. They voted on it up and down a freaking continent. Wow, that had never happened before. There had been very few democracies in the history of planet Earth, and the ones that existed often failed. Democracies can fail. You need to understand this. Republics can fail. But the ones that existed were tiny, typically little city-states, ancient Athens, pre-imperial Rome, people smaller than New Haven, worshiped the same god or gods, spoke the same language, and they failed, they flickered out. Here's the history of the world. History of thugs, basically, kings, emperors, czars, sultans, Mughal lords, tribal chieftains. And then, we, the people of the United States, in actual fact, did ordain a constitution. Even the democracies never actually had a democratic process by which they adopted the thing. One person hands it down from on high, the lawgiver, Solon, Lycurgus. That was the world in 1787. Democracy almost nowhere on planet Earth. Some in Britain, some in Switzerland, that's about it. And then we, the people, the Dutch are in the process of losing their self-government, so are the Florentines and the Venetians, so that's about it. And then we, the people of the United States, these aren't my ancestors, but I can affiliate with the project, I can choose to. I'm an American, I was born here. But these are not my forebears, genetically. We, the people, actually ordained a constitution. We put it to a vote. The winners won by this much. The losers acquiesced. What a concept, because they lost fair and square. They had good ideas. The winners actually listened to the losers' good ideas. We call that the Bill of Rights. What a concept, like listening to the other side. Maybe they have a point, even though they lost. And then it got better and better over time. We made amends, we the people, for the lapses of the sins of earlier generations. We end slavery, we promise black suffrage and equal citizenship to, there's women's suffrage in our lifetime. We get rid of poll tax disenfranchisement, let 18-year-olds vote. Even if you're not an American, wow, that's an astonishing set of achievements you can learn from. A smart person, dumb people don't learn. Smart people learn from their own mistakes. Really smart people learn from other people's mistakes, experiences, because the world today is largely democratic. Imperfectly so, but half the world is democratic by population and landmass. Indian subcontinent, that's 1 billion people. Japan, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, they're struggling. They're backsliding. So are we. by the way, but half the world is democratic in the wake of World War II and the Cold War. And that project began in the United States, okay? The modern world was made in America, in Philadelphia, okay? And that's the story that I tell in this book that I want you to read. But that's because if you're an official, you take an oath to the thing. If you're a citizen, it's the only thing we have in common. And if you're someone out there in the world, oh, you can learn from this project, because whether you want to admit it or not, and the French maybe don't want to admit it, they actually descend from us, okay? Because at the time of the Constitution, they're an absolutist monarchy. Today, they're a not bad republic. I think California's better for reasons we can talk about. Don't tell a French person this, but I think it's true. So they can learn from us because we did it first, and we've done it pretty well given the constraints we faced.
Akhil, what about, my question also was about judges and how they adjudicated. And what frightens me is that judges who aren't originalists, is my understanding, do what they think ought to be done.
Correct.
And that scares me because who protects me from the court except, I would imagine, the adherence to the document?
Well, they're good and decent people, and I know many of them pretty well. I would say more than half of them are my contacts in my cell phone. I clerked for Steve Breyer. I testified on behalf of Brett Kavanaugh before the Christine Blasey Ford episode, and I took no position on that because I wasn't in the room when that happened or didn't happen. But I like these folks. I respect them. They're good and decent people. I love Sonia Sotomayor. She's just such a wonderful human being. Clarence Thomas is a dear friend. I really like Sam Alito. They're good people. It's easy to demonize them. Almost all of them, okay, I'll be very blunt. They went to good schools. I like this. They studied hard and got good grades. Oh, I like this very much because I'm just like that. See, I'm a little teacher type, okay, and nerd. They all, almost all of them, most of them clerked on the Supreme Court as youngsters. And they could have made, with those CVs, gazillions of dollars. You have no idea. Well, you actually do, some of you, how much, New York lawyers get paid. And they could have done that. And almost all of them chose instead a path of public service, which they got paid a lot less. They were judges before they were justices. Every one of them was a sitting federal court of appeals judge at the time of appointment, except Elena Kagan, who was a solicitor general, someone who worked closely with judges. And, they got a decent salary, but nothing like they could have made in private practice. And the odds that they were going to be on the Supreme Court were infinitesimally small because there are a lot of judges and very few justices. So they're good and decent people, and they were all confirmed for lower judicial positions, except Elena, who was confirmed for Solicitor General. And then they were confirmed a second time for the Supreme Court, and they work hard, and they do a lot of their own work, and many of them are, and they talk to each other, and some of them cross the political aisle way more than anyone else in Washington, D.C. So I have 4 students who are senators of the United States, and the Senate is bad these days, and the House, don't get me started. Okay, so in Washington, D.C., they're the least dysfunctional of the branches. They are. And they're good and decent people, and we've picked them several times, we the citizenry, first for lower courts and then for the Supreme Court. So that's a lot. Okay, but why am I an originalist? Because I actually know them, and they're not as smart as the American people have been over the course of our history at our most important moments, the Revolutionary War, a Civil War. So 9 people, even well-intentioned, are not going to be as good. I think just their track record, the Supreme Court's track record, is not nearly as good as the Constitution's track record, honestly understood. So the Constitution, it's about George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and Ben Franklin. Oh, and then it's about Abe Lincoln. Oh, and then it's about Martin King in our lifetime, because these are the people who generate the constitutional texts and the amendments that I want you to take seriously, because as good as the court is, the Constitution's better.
So you take in your book, you take an unorthodox look at the founders. And I mean, in grammar school, I was taught that Madison was the architect of the Constitution.
Father of the Constitution.
Yeah.
How many, raise your hands if that's what you're taught. James Madison is the father of the Constitution. I'm seeing a lot of people raise their hands, and the rest of you apparently were raised by wolves, you know, because that's what everyone teaches.
So
except my friend Aaron Hull, you know, who now teaches it differently. He's out there. He teaches in Greenwich High School. But everyone back in the day was taught James Madison's that's his epithet, his moniker. You know, he's father of the Constitution.
So my head was exploding because the nuns drilled that into my head. Mm-hmm. But so you say it's not a Madisonian Constitution, but is indeed a Washingtonian Constitution.
Correct.
Can you elaborate a little on that?
Yeah, I just came back last week from our nation's capital, which is, of course, called Madison, D.C. And I looked up and I saw the Madison Monument, 555 feet. And of course, James Madison was our first president, unanimously elected and unanimously reelected. And of course, he won the Revolutionary War. No, the real James Madison actually, as president, let the Capitol burn to the ground. And that's why you're not on Mount Rushmore. You know, that's not a good look, you see. So the Constitution was designed, and this is in the book, because it's about the big six, especially Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, your first four presidents, plus Franklin and Hamilton. Those by acclamation are the most important founders. Oh, and they disagreed about things, just like we disagree about things today. And sometimes they work together, and sometimes they pulled apart. James Madison works with Alexander Hamilton to get the Constitution ratified. It's called the Federalist Papers. And then he backstabs Hamilton when Jefferson comes back into town, because I don't know why, that was a bad choice, I think. I'm a Hamilton guy. The book is dedicated, among others, to Lin-Manuel Miranda and Ron Chernow. And Hamilton and Washington kind of pair up, and Jefferson and Madison kind of pair up. But yes, who could think otherwise? So, Washington's the father of the Constitution. I'll give you the basic facts. And it matters for all sorts of things. If you actually, this library probably has a subscription to America's historical newspapers. You can just plug in the phrase, father of the Constitution, do a word search, and it will refer to Washington dozens of times, not a single reference to Madison before 1825. George Washington actually has the only army on the continent. He defeats the most powerful army in the world, and military force the world has ever seen. And then he could make himself emperor, king, czar, dictator, and he doesn't. He walks away. Okay? Today, they don't walk away. Whether you talk about Biden or Trump, they don't walk away. You know, it takes the jaws of life to pry them, you know, from power. George Washington, okay, here's what previous people who had military power did. Caesar crosses the Rubicon and makes himself actually strongman, a ruler of ancient Rome. And Darius or Xerxes, they're generals, and they demand power for themselves. Cromwell will name himself Lord Protector. Napoleon will grab, this is after the American Revolution, but not long after, around 1800, will grab a crown from the Pope's hands and put it on his own head, and eventually will make himself emperor. King isn't even good enough for Napoleon. He has to be emperor. Oh. So, and Washington walks away. And then his country needs him, so he's summoned back. He's the unanimously elected presiding officer at Philadelphia. No one's heard of James Madison. You know, he's 5'4". Okay. The only two people that Americans have heard of are Benjamin Franklin, who is incomparably great, and George Washington, and they work together. Okay, those are the only two people that Americans have heard of. And America is foundering, and these two great Americans come to Philadelphia. Washington's the presiding officer. They meet in Franklin's home city of Philadelphia, but they pick Washington. And he's the president, and he holds the gavel. That's why he's called Mr. President. That's why we call this guy the president, because it was designed by Washington for Washington. He doesn't speak of Philadelphia because he doesn't have to, okay? There are 55 people in all. He's one of the 55, so there are 54 others. 5 of them are basically his little assistants, his law clerks from 5 different states. There's Hamilton from New York, and Mifflin from Pennsylvania, and Charles Coatsworth Pinckney from South Carolina, and McHenry from Maryland, and Edmund Randolph from Virginia. And they just do what he says. He smiles and they vote yes. He frowns and they vote no. And he's talking to people after hours, you know, at the dinner parties and all the rest. And people vote for the Constitution because Washington's for it. It has 2 big features that are different from state constitutions: a really powerful central government and a supremely powerful federal executive, a dangerously powerful federal executive. That's because it was designed for the person that everyone understood would be the first president, Washington. And people who are on the fence vote for it because Washington vouches for it, and so does Franklin. And Washington is the unanimously elected first president of the United States. Every elector votes for him. Then he's unanimously reelected, and then he steps down yet again. How could anyone think that it's James Madison? This is absurd. Okay? James Madison, by the way, gets nothing that he really wants at Philadelphia. Nothing particularly distinctive about Madison passes in Philadelphia. He wants a proportionally representative Senate. He wants a collective veto called a Council of Revision. He wants the federal government to be able to veto all state laws. He gets none of the things that are particularly his ideas. Most of your constitution is basically what state constitutions do. They have bicameral legislatures, tripartite regimes, but their governors are really weak. Only one of them has a veto pen. None of them have a veto pen and a pardon pen, independent election, a 4-year term, perpetual re-eligibility. Most governors have that today, but only because all your state constitutions were changed afterwards to click into alignment with the federal constitution. Federal Constitution is designed by Washington for Washington, and he's so effective, he doesn't even leave his fingerprints on it, so people think it's Madison's or something like that, okay? And the president is a very dangerous office, far more so today. And if you think it's Madison, you will miss that fundamental point. You'll miss other things too. Madison opposes a bank, says it's unconstitutional. Hamilton designs it, Washington signs it into law. It's clearly constitutional. Madison's a nitwit. Okay, Madison opposes all sorts of things, carriage taxes. He gets his butt kicked unanimously in the Supreme Court, Madison does. We call that McCulloch versus Maryland. He says, a tax on carriages is unconstitutional. Supreme Court unanimously rules against him. James Madison actually, George Washington ends by freeing his slaves. That's what he does on his deathbed. James Madison does not do this. Thomas Jefferson does not do this. And ultimately, ours is going to become an anti-slavery constitution, and it's Washington, not Madison or Jefferson. And it matters.
We'll get back to Washington in a minute, but you seem to have soured a little bit on Jefferson. And I just want to read one quote from the book, which just made me chuckle a little bit. Talking about Jefferson, people lie, politicians lie more than most, and Thomas Jefferson lied more than most politicians. He lied to his friends, he lied to his constituents, he lied to Washington, and he lied to himself.
And that's what slavery will do to you, okay? Because he has a lie at the heart of his heart, and evil will corrupt you. And he starts out, so if you had met me, Steve, at 20 years old, I would have said, if I'm ever lucky enough to get married and have a kid, and by the way, I still think that's the right order to do things, very old-fashioned. My wife was raised by the nuns, just like you. But I would have said, Steve, if I'm ever lucky enough to have a son, if If my wife agrees, I'd like to name him Jefferson. That's what I was at age 20. And the more I've studied Jefferson, the more he's disappointed me. In the new book, that's not true of Abe Lincoln. The more I study Abe Lincoln, the more I fall in love with him. And he's human. He's not perfect, but wow, he's amazing. But Jefferson starts out very idealistic. He wants to actually end slavery and have all sorts of reforms, and he writes soaring prose, and he's very inspiring. But as time goes on, he gets worse and worse and worse because he's corrupt. He doesn't want to get rid of slavery. He forms a political party. He has to fight Adams, who wants to make it a crime to criticize Donald Trump. I mean, John Adams. You can't make it a crime to criticize yourself. Okay, you just can't. And that's why Adams gets ultimately kicked out, thrown out on his ass. He's the only early president who fails of re-election. And Jefferson has to mobilize to protect speech against this assault on freedom, because Adams has forgotten himself. Okay, so I understand why Jefferson needed to create a party, but then it is a Southern party, and his bread is buttered on the Southern side, and he sides with his party, even over virtue. So if he were alive today, he would be closer. I'm just being blunt. And there are reasons to pick your party if you think the other party is horrible, but he picked party over what he knew to be correct, so he's closer to a Mitch McConnell or a Kevin McCarthy than he is to a Liz Cheney. And people can choose, party over what they know to be right, or what they know to be right over party. He basically picks party, and he becomes worse and worse and worse on slavery, and he never frees his slaves because he spends his money on wine, women, and song. And that's a downward arc, and his biographers don't trace that for you. Aduma Malone doesn't tell that story. Madison has a downward arc too. They're joined at the hip, and biographers of Madison don't tell you that story. Washington is not perfect at all. He's a pretty stern, strict, maybe even mean slaveholder, as a young man, but he gets better and better and better. And as I've aged, I've realized, oh God, I've made so many mistakes as a young person. What a stupid, idiot I was. I can't change them. I wish I could change all my mistakes, can't. The only thing I can do is try to get better as I age, and I think Washington gets better as he ages, and Jefferson and Madison get worse.
So what amazes me about the Founding Fathers is that they did have faults and foibles, especially Washington, but he achieved greatness anyway. He did great things.
He did.
But one thing I thought was interesting when you talk about the Declaration, and I think I have this right, but we not only said, hey, England, the heck with you, we're going to leave, but we gave philosophical reasons to the entire world.
We submitted facts to a candid world, yes. We thought we had reasons, and we wanted to share them with everyone.
And you say that Jefferson, though, again, the nuns, I could see them hitting my knuckles on this, but
My wife was very intimidated by the nuns, too.
Who isn't? But that, and I think he even said it himself in the beginning, but he didn't really write it as opposed to putting it all together from the ideas of Americans. He was merely a good scribe as opposed to
I do tell a top-down story about the Big Six by acclamation. And there's a second tier. We could talk about the Patrick Henrys and the Gouverneur Morrises and the Richard Henry Lees and the Samuel Adams. But the Big Six, that's like the great man theory of history, Thomas Carlyle or something. But I also tell a bottom-up story. Ultimately, the Constitution was drafted in effect by America because it's basically just picking the best ideas from all the state constitutions and putting them together. The only two differences are very strong federal government, because state constitutions aren't going to have a position on that, and a strong executive. But other than that, it's state constitution. It's just cutting and pasting, in effect. America, in effect, originates the Constitution. America ratifies the Constitution. America fashions the Declaration of Independence. There are all sorts of cities and localities and grand juries and local groups that are generating statements of grievance. And the Declaration of Independence just kind of pulls all those together. It's Jefferson at his best says it's basically just a restatement of the American mind, okay? And then and even at Philadelphia, it's not just his. Benjamin Franklin is there next to him, and so is John Adams. It's a collective product. But then it turns out to be pretty popular, and Jefferson basically says, oh, mine, mine, mine. Okay, and on his obelisk, he says, author of the Declaration of Independence, which he didn't quite say early on. He was the lead draftsman, which is different than author of the Declaration of Independence. But you know, when he runs against John Adams, it's very useful for twice. He loses the first time and wins the second time, you know, and that's what, you know, Trump was basically hoping for. Well, I lost to Biden the first time, but I'll beat him the second time. It's very good, you know, for his partisan purposes to, you know, have all of his team stress that he's the author of the Declaration of Independence. But really, it comes more organically bottom up from America.
So back to the towering figure of Washington. You mentioned, you know, that he said in fact, he said almost nothing during the Constitutional Convention, but that he didn't have to because everybody knew what he wanted and they gave it to him. But he did say one thing at the end, and you write that one of the best critiques of the Constitution deplored its unduly small house. Washington argued for a larger house, and I believe it was 40,000, you know, per district, and he wanted it to be 30,000.
Right.
But today, we have 330 million population today, and in 1929 we limited the size of the House to 435.
Yes.
So now the average House member represents about 765,000 people. Did we make a mistake? It would seem to me that that's not enough representation from the intent of the founders. So
there are two big objections to the Constitution. One you've heard of, there's no Bill of Rights, you know. And ordinary farmers see this immediately, and here's why they do, because state constitutions have bills of rights.
You're talking about the time, right? At the time.
In 1787, they meet behind closed doors. They unveil their, convene in late May, and they unveil their plan on September 17th. We call that Constitution Day. And it's just a plan, it's just a proposal. It's gonna have to be ratified. And the next year, more people get to vote and deliberate on how they and their posterity be governed than the history of planet Earth. That's what I think is where the modern world begins. And it's gonna lead to democracy across half of the planet in the 20th and 21st century. So, but the first thing people say within hours at least, or days, is, dude, you forgot the rights. State constitutions have bills of rights. This one doesn't. They're comparing it to state constitutions. This is constitution making 2.0, because in 1776, we adopt state constitutions in 11 of the 13 states. We don't in Connecticut, they didn't in Rhode Island, but everywhere else they did. So people say, you don't have a Bill of Rights. And that's one big criticism, and it's a pretty valid one. So the Federalists actually say, you know, you're right. If the thing gets ratified, we'll work with you. And we call that the Bill of Rights. And Madison works on that, but so does Washington. The second big objection is Congress is too small to be genuinely representative. Jefferson from France has a third objection. He thinks there should be term limits for presidents. They call that rotation. So why did they think Congress was too small? Compare it to states, okay? You know how many state lawmakers there are in the lower house of the 13 state assemblies? 1,500 if you add all state assemblymen together. And now instead we have 65 people for the whole continent. That's supposed to be representative. 65 congresspersons compared to 1,500 state lawmakers. The 65 is smaller than the legislatures of all but 2 of the states. I think Delaware and New Jersey maybe have state legislatures that are about that small, but it's smaller than the Virginia legislature. It's way small. Virginia has 400. Massachusetts has 400. So it looks too small to be truly representative. Ordinary people aren't going to be able to have the name recognition to, to be one of the 9 most prominent people in all of Virginia, because it's going to be the 9 or 10 most prominent, only 65, so 9 or 10 from all of Virginia. Shopkeeper can't win, if that's the rule. Shopkeeper could be, if he's a good shopkeeper, good innkeeper. Roger Sherman is has a tavern in New Haven. You could become a member of the state assembly, perhaps, but he's not going to have the name recognition. So they say it's too small, and Washington anticipates this, and on the last day he proposes a modification. There should be one representative for every 30,000 rather than 40,000. And you can even see the smut. They'd already inked the thing, the parchment. And he just proposes, and they all say, oh, whatever you want. And the smudge, they make an erasure in the parchment. You can still see the smudge in the National Archives version. That's how influential he is, okay? That's influence. Now, you're saying, well, today, and not only couldn't you run if you're just an innkeeper or something, the concern might be that ordinary people won't know the representatives, okay? Fair enough. But you're saying, is it too small today, 435? Here's the problem, and if you want to read more on this, read the Federalist number 55. Federalist Papers are a series of newspaper op-eds, 85 in all as eventually organized. And they're a series of newspaper op-eds saying, vote for the Constitution. And they talk about various objections. Federalist 55 is about congressional size, and it's written by Madison. And Madison says, look, here's the problem. Increased size is good for the legislature, but only up to a point. 5 is too small, it's not safe, because 3 would be a quorum, 2 would be a majority, you can bribe those 2 if you're Putin. Okay, so that's too small to be safe. 50 is probably better than 5, okay? But is 500 better than 50? Is 5,000 better than 500? No. Is 50,000 better than 5,000? At a certain point, the problem is you can't talk to each other. So the legislature can't be more than a certain size because you have to talk to each other. So as dysfunctional, so I'll push back against your premise. As dysfunctional as Congress is at 430, I think it would be worse at, 870? 430, it's very difficult for them actually to talk to each other. So welcome to having a big country. That's where we are. My friend Danielle Allen, who just resigned from the Washington Post yesterday, she sent me an email, thinks it's too small. There are people who think it's too small, and they're not crazy people, but I actually think if you look at the great democracies around the world, almost none of them are more than 600, 700. If you look at Parliament or the German legislature or the Indian legislature or the Israeli Knesset, almost no great democracy has more than 700. And I'm just not sure that 435 is actually too small, truthfully.
Okay. I might disagree with that just because I think that it would be harder for special interest groups to pour money into things if it were, say, triple the size. I'm not too sure it scares me. But
if it were triple the size, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to talk to each other.
I don't think they talk to each other now.
I agree. So if anything, maybe it's too big.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and if it's really, really big, none of them has much clout, and I think it's going to be difficult perhaps for them to stand up against a president, okay? The Senate's going to be better at standing up against a president because it's smaller, and we may need someone who can stand up against a president.
But yeah, I was going to ask you about the presidency, but since you mentioned the Senate, I've always wondered about the 17th Amendment. I just wonder if we made a mistake. I know, we have an amendment, it's constitutional, of course, but it seems to me that we have set a balance between the House and the Senate, and we, in essence, made 2 houses of representatives, both beholding to the voter and both beholding to the passions of the people. And what fears me is that there's no one to say no to the people. And I would argue that I believe that's one reason why we have a $35 trillion debt. Am I off base on that? Did we make a mistake on it? Did we?
I once agreed with you. And then I learned why the 17th Amendment came to be. Now, the world's expert on this is actually Professor Amar, but not the Professor Amar who's speaking to you, but my kid brother, Professor Vic Amar. He went to the Yale Law School. He clerked on the Supreme Court. He's a constitutional scholar. He was dean of the University of Illinois College of Law, and he's written some very important pieces on the Senate. Here's the history behind it. When state legislatures pick the Senate, sometimes, actually, they just couldn't even get their act together because of bicameralism, and they picked no one because the state House wanted X and the state Senate wanted Y, and so for years, states actually went unrepresented, so that's not so great. And I don't love the 2 senators per state. I grew up in California, so it never seemed quite fair to me, but let's just bracket that. It's not going anywhere immediately. But so there was gridlock in the states. Much worse than gridlock, there was a lot of corruption. State legislators were bribed by the candidates. I know that shocks you, but, there was a time when there were these plutocrats who ran America, Jeff Bezos. And that's the problem of the 1890s, the Jay Goulds, the John D. Rockefellers, the J.P. Morgans and Leland Stanfords, the robber barons, and they had the politicians in their pocket, and they bought laws, and they bought lawmakers, and they bought state lawmakers. So there was a lot of corruption. I explained some of this in my new book, which is the period between 1840 and 1920. Now, and the Senate was a millionaire's club. Now, today, it still is largely a millionaire's club, and elections are ridiculously expensive. They are. Maybe more expensive than bribing lawmakers, but it's clean money rather than dirty money because the money goes into persuading voters one by one by one, and you can't bribe the voters. There's just too many of them. So, and now you might think, I'm partisan, but I'll just tell you, I never liked Linda McLean. I didn't. And she's this worldwide wrestling person. And she spent gazillions of dollars, and the more she spent, the more I disliked her. But is this a great country or what? I get to vote against her, okay? And Carly Fiorina spends lots of money, and people don't like her, and they didn't vote for her. And Jeb Bush had $80 million, and people didn't vote for him. What's her name? Meg Whitman runs against Jerry Brown. She's the head of eBay, and he kicks her ass. And Donald Trump actually in 2016 spends almost nothing in the primaries, but people liked him. I think even, here's the story. So I actually believe people should be able to spend money on advertising. I think Citizens United is rightly decided. People get to actually run ads and make pitches, and you, the voters, decide, you see. So here's the story I want you to understand. And, we're getting close. So there's this new dog food, and it's not selling. And after 6 months, the CEO convenes the senior executives and says, what's the problem? We've got this beautiful package. People love it. We've focus grouped the thing. People, like the product, and we've got the best ad campaign. We've won all these prizes. Why isn't this dog food selling? Silence around the room. Finally, the most junior executive, junior vice president, raises her hand and says, sir, the dogs won't eat the food. Well, if the dogs don't eat the food, you're not going to sell a lot of dog food now, are you? Now, in this story, we, the voters, we're the dogs, okay? And we have to decide whether we're going to, in effect, accept the ad or not. So we had the 17th Amendment because lawmakers were corrupt. It turns out they actually were, people were buying and selling Senate seats, because this is what happens when you have a smaller group. You can buy lawmakers. That's why we had it way back when.
I think we have time for one more question. I was going to ask you about the presidency, but I have to ask this. So Washington is the indispensable man.
Yes.
I don't think people realize how, through every facet of our development, he was the towering figure.
Right. I suggest that if he had been struck by lightning, I'm not sure we would have a constitution or a country.
Yeah, I would
and
have to
if
agree.
something had happened to James Madison, you get the same constitution that we had. You take him out, and let's say he's from Virginia, and you take out Elbridge Gerry, and you stick in, he's from Massachusetts, 2 other people, a Massachusetts guy named John Adams and a Virginian, say Thomas Jefferson. Neither of them were at Philadelphia. You take those two guys out, you put two other people in, you get the same thing. Their wins against replacement are 0.
And even,
okay. But if Washington's hit by lightning, maybe no constitution, maybe no country, maybe no modern world that we have today. And he has his flaws, he does, okay? But he is the indispensable man.
So, and even John Adams, if you took him out, maybe Sam Adams would have taken his place.
Yeah.
And as great
and
as
John Adams
is,
wasn't there at Philadelphia. He was off in France.
Yeah. But so
and Sam Adams wasn't there.
So you know my favorite, but who do you consider this? Is there a second, or close anyway, indispensable?
Well, yeah, our friend Ben Franklin. These are the two greatest people in America, and Franklin supports Washington, and if you'd undermine Washington, maybe the thing wouldn't have worked. Franklin is very gracious. He's a senior person, and so he wins the peace diplomatically. Washington wins the war on the battlefield, but he wins the war because Franklin's gotten the French to pay for the whole thing, which is a very good deal. You know, at Yorktown, there are 2 French fighters for every American, okay? So Franklin and Washington together, you know, win the thing. Franklin is this amazing, he's too old to lead, though. I know, I mean, Joe Biden. I mean, but he is a patriot and he supports Washington at every turn. A very great man, easy to underestimate because he's so folksy and charming. The guy is a math genius. He's astonishing, and he's this amazing entrepreneur, and he's a fun, generative kind of wit and wisdom. Poor Richard's Almanac, and he's a glue that holds America together. I didn't understand the greatness of Washington until I started researching the book. But he's an avuncular figure. He pulls everyone together. Maybe like Eisenhower in his later years, or something like that. So America has 2 great leaders, Washington and Franklin, and a big cast of characters beyond them. Washington, though, doesn't know how to do certain things, like create a tax system, create a fiscal structure. That's Alexander Hamilton, and he's Washington's right hand. And frankly, Jefferson and Madison are making trouble for them because they don't understand banks, trade, war, finance, commerce. There's so many things they don't understand. What they do understand is slavery, okay? And so I'm a Washington person and therefore a Hamilton man because Hamilton is Washington's right hand, and I'm a Franklin person, and Franklin will push hard against slavery, and God bless him for that.
We'll go to questions in 1 second, but one of my favorite stories of Franklin is that he's a loyalist, and he's very loyal to the king, and he goes to England, and he goes to the pit, which is
the cockpit. The
cockpit, yeah, and they humiliate him there, and he stands there and he takes it. At least that's according to what's written in the painting. And he comes back and he says, pardon my language, but screw you, I'll start my own country. And he does.
He does.
It's just absolutely fabulous.
He's very loyal to his king and the idiots around him look down on America, look down on Franklin. He's lowborn, he's the 10th child. His father is a candle maker. He's the product of a second marriage. He doesn't have formal education. He's a nobody, and he's one of the great scientists of the world. But these idiot Brits, he's American, he's low-born, he has no formal education, and and he's so loyal to them. And these elite Brits, this is how they lose America, because they don't understand actually our idea that in America, everyone's born equal, and you can rise or fall, based on your grit and your talent and your virtues. And so they do humiliate Franklin in a thing called the Hutchinson Letters affair that I narrate in the book. And Franklin's heart turns, and he goes from being the most loyal of British subjects to the most ardent of American patriots, yes.
And I would argue that's one of the pivotal moments. But we'll get to questions. I would just ask, if you're going to ask a question, just get to your question so we can get as many as we can.
Thank you to our guests for the fascinating conversation tonight. We will open up the program now. If you are able, we invite you to come up to the microphone to ask your question, and we will answer as many questions as time allows, so please be mindful of that and limit your interaction to one question.
Can you share your thoughts on the presidential immunity decision?
I went on MSNBC and I wrote for The Atlantic that I think it's the worst constitutional decision of my lifetime. And it makes the Constitution itself unconstitutional, and I'll just prove it to you in 2 minutes. If there really was immunity for ex-presidents, criminal immunity, where does it say that in the Constitution? It doesn't. Where does it say that in the Federalist Papers? It doesn't. Find me one person in this entire year-long debate who said anything like that, and I will buy you dinner. And they don't point to a single person who said that. And George Washington never wanted that. And what they did say again and again and again is no man is above the law. There are no kings in America. Okay? So I just proved textually and historically and structurally no man is above the law. That's a structural argument. Historically, no one ever said this. Textually, it doesn't say that this is all made up. Now I'm going to say, prove to you, and it's inconsistent with the relevant precedents, like the Nixon tapes case, so that's bad. Now I'm going to show you that what it does say. It says presidents are impeachable for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. It says bribery. And obviously, that's about bribery in connection with wielding your office. You're bribed to veto a bill, to pardon someone, to appoint someone, to fire someone. That's impeachable, and the Senate tries impeachments, and the impeachment clause says explicitly, once you've been convicted of impeachment, you're subject to criminal prosecution just like everyone else. So wow, it says all these things. You just made the Constitution itself unconstitutional. This is bad. And you disregarded a great opinion, the Nixon tapes case, and you did it in a partisan way. This is bad. Now, here's what I can say on the other side. It wouldn't be crazy to have a rule that ex-presidents can't be criminally prosecuted. There are other countries who have such a rule, and here's the argument. Because otherwise they'll never leave even if they lose fair and square. Because, yes, they stole all this money. And yes, they committed all these crimes in office, and we're gonna let them keep their loot, and we're gonna let them sleep the sleep of the blessed and not be prosecuted, because that way they will leave. Because if instead, as soon as they're out of office, you're going to go after them and take all their loot and take even their liberty, they will fight to the death. Okay? And there are countries in the world that say because of that, it's worth it to buy them off, give them their $1 billion, let them have total immunity and in exile, either internally or in some other country. There are countries that do that in Africa and Asia. They are. It's not a preposterous idea. It's simply not our Constitution. And if you're originalist, you pay attention to what we actually agreed to. George Washington never believed in any of this, so I think it's the worst decision of my lifetime.
Yeah, wondering if you could speak briefly to the impetus behind the three-book cycle, which, aside from the historical narrative, is the dialogue between the legal community and the historical community, and why you felt compelled to write the three-book cycle for that conversation. And when can we get the second book?
The first one is called The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation. We talk to each other. Oh my God, what a concept. 1760 to 1840, that's how we become a we. And by we, I mean we the people. Us is a pun. The words that made us, as in the United States, or we the people. In 1760, there's no such thing as America. There's Massachusetts. There's South Carolina, there's New York. They don't talk to each other. They talk to Britain, they don't talk to each other. But by the middle of, by just 15 years later, they're talking to each other. They're staging a revolution together. They're speaking together, they're fighting together. Then they're going to create a strong, indivisible union. That's the Constitution, okay? So that's how we become a we. That's 1760 to 1840. And why 1840? Because the last founder dies then, or in that period. The founders die, and the next generation comes on board. Volume 2 I just finished. It's called Born Equal, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1840 to 1920. It's the next 80 years, and it begins sort of, with blacks groaning in chains, and it's going to end with women getting the vote everywhere. Racial equality, female equality, abolition of slavery. That's a great story. It's the next 80 years. And volume 3, that's going to be out in a year. I sent it off to my publisher. Born Equal, Created Equal. We are, it's taking seriously the words of the Declaration and actually saying, so we got to get rid of slavery and say people are born equal, black or white, male or female, Jew or Gentile, gay or straight, in wedlock or out of wedlock. You're born equal. That's volume 2. Volume 3 will be 1920 to the current period. It's called Earth's Best Hope. It's where America starts to engage the world. So that's why, but in 1920, because that's when women get the vote, which is a pretty big deal. If Joe Biden were here, he'd say it's a big effing deal. Now, if I could have told the story of America in one volume, I would have, but I couldn't, and give you the detail, telling you about who Hamilton is, who Elizabeth Cady Stanton is, who Harriet Beecher Stowe is, who Abe Lincoln is, or Frederick Douglass. So I want to give you the characters and what they did, Martin Luther King in the 20th century. And so that's why I wrote it in 3. That's why I punctuate it in 80-year periods, okay? Because we move from becoming a people to promote affirming equality to engaging the world. Now, why do we need this? Because I think we do. This is what I've devoted my life to. Truthfully, I could have made a lot of money doing other things. I was good at doing other things. But we Americans are at great risk of collapsing, because we don't have a national narrative, a unifying narrative that tells us the story of us. And the narrative has to be nonpartisan. I have a politics, and I've been honest about it, but you will not know my politics from reading this book, okay? So the only thing that we Americans have in common is the Constitution and the story behind it. What we have in common is Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton, and each one of them is good on some things. Now, net, I'm more pro-Washington and Franklin, and I'm down on Jefferson and Madison because of slavery, in large part, okay? But we need a national narrative. American kids need to understand who George Washington was and who Abraham Lincoln was, and they don't today, unfortunately. So we need this national story because it's the only thing that we Americans have in common.
And one thing I have to say that I admire you about is you're intellectually honest. It doesn't, your political view is what it is, but it doesn't matter. You're intellectually honest.
So let me give you 2 or 3 examples. I'm personally pro-choice, but I think Roe versus Wade was not persuasive, and the court was made good legal arguments for overruling it in the Dobbs case. Citing Akhil. I don't own a gun in my home, never have had one. I'm not a gun guy, but I think for a variety of reasons, having to not just with the Second Amendment, but state constitutions and the Civil War amendments, I think you have a right to have a gun in your home if you want to. I don't have one in mine. I'm not actually keen on the death penalty, don't like it, but I think it's constitutional in a variety of domains. I just told you 3 pretty big things where my politics are different than my honest view about what the Constitution does and doesn't say. Abortion, death penalty, and guns. Those are 3 big issues.
Hi.
Hi. To alleviate...
You have to introduce yourself, Alex.
Alex Knopf. Had a pleasure to be a visiting faculty with Professor Amar for many years at the Yale Law School.
And the person who spoke before you, by the way, is Aaron Hull, who's a great public school teacher here in this part of Connecticut. And thank you for your service, Aaron.
Did you rig the questions?
No, I didn't.
So, Akhil, to alleviate what may be a lingering sense of confusion, could you please describe the difference between Amar originalism and Scalia originalism?
Scalia knew no history at all. He was a poser, okay? He didn't, damn it. It's not simply that he didn't write 8 books on the Constitution, which I have in his history. He didn't read 8 books on the Constitution. He didn't. He loved words. He was into words, so he writes about statutory interpretation. He was into dictionaries. That's not originalism. Originalism is understanding the text and its historical context. And that wasn't his love. That is my passion. So that's one. Number 2, I'm going to tell you about the amendments, and he actually tended to underemphasize the amendments that made amends for the founding because he in his own, because he's more of an, a 1780s guy. I don't think he's ever really reconciled himself truthfully to woman suffrage, okay? I'm going to tell you a story about the amendments, and he never did that so well. So he grabbed the label, originalism, fine, but originalism is as originalism does. And as originalism does, you actually have to know your history, and he did. He joined Bush versus Gore, which was a disgrace, okay, because they just made that up. And he had some good things that he did some, had some good opinions, but he said Obamacare was unconstitutional. Of course it isn't. It's easily and obviously constitutional. Do you know why we have a national bank? We had a national bank for national security reasons, because it's pretty hard and pretty darn useful to have it, to win a war, to be able to collect money and spend it, okay? And once you understand that, actually, and I said this at the time, Obamacare is a national security measure and a tax measure, and you say, really, Professor? Yes, 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 because here's what I wrote way back when. I said, the next attack is likely to be biological, okay? I'm talking about Wuhan 10 years, 15 years before, and it's gonna be, and you're gonna need herd immunity for that, and you're gonna need vaccines for that, and preventative health care. And so it might be a good idea, it might be a bad idea, but of course it's constitutional. The federal government has the power to do this. And it's a tax, and so, and it's constitutional 6 ways from Sunday, but you need to actually understand Washington and Hamilton, which he, sometimes did and sometimes didn't. So here are the great originalists in history, because Scalia is not one of them, nor was Bork, who was my teacher. They didn't know any history, and I'm telling you this honestly, So, it's not Mies, it's not Bork, it's not Scalia, it's not Thomas, it's not Gorsuch. To be a true originalist, you need to know your history backwards and forwards and sideways, and you don't, and this is how we die. Now, if you read the books, which Scalia didn't, you will know more than I knew before I wrote those books. You will, because I learned a lot in researching the books. You'll know almost half of what I know even having written the books, which is a lot. And the justices, I'm pissed at them because they don't read the books and they claim they're originalists. No, you don't get to do that unless you've done the work. And Scalia didn't do the work. Now, here are the great originalists. John Marshall in McCulloch versus Maryland, great originalist, text, history, and structure. Sidekick Joseph Story writes a 3-volume commentaries on the Constitution, a very academic guy, Harvard professor, who's also on the Supreme Court. You know who the greatest originalist of all time is? His name is Abraham Lincoln. And he's going to follow what the Constitution actually says and tell you all about it. And it's hiding in plain sight. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He is making an argument about history, you see? He's saying, here's what the Declaration was all about. Here's what the Constitution, he's not looking at dictionaries. Originalists pay attention to text and history. And I'm in a tradition of John Marshall and Abraham Lincoln. John Marshall Harlan, the great dissenter in Plessy versus Ferguson, says it says equal. This isn't equal. The great originalist of the last 80 years was actually a liberal, actually a Democrat. His name was Hugo Black. He always carried a pocket copy of the Constitution around with him. What a weird guy. He actually takes the text and history seriously. He knew a ton of history because he was obsessed by history. That's not Antonin Scalia's obsession. Antony's, here are a few more copies of the, there we go. Oh, this one is a particularly interesting version. It's called Hugo Black's Pocket U.S. Constitution. So this is a Cato Institute. Betsy DeVos gave me that. When I have conservative versions and liberal versions, they say the same thing, it turns out, actually. But I have FedSoc versions. But originalists care about history. Scalia knew none. Good originalists are going to know the history not just of the founding, but of the Reconstruction, of women's suffrage amendments, of the 1960s amendments. Scalia tended to underemphasize those themes.
Hugo Black was a textualist as well, right? But he knew it was that in conjunction with knowing history.
Yes, he's a text and history guy. And when I went to law school, arrived in law school, I'd never heard of this guy. And he's not perfect. He's a former Klansman, okay? But he actually didn't believe in what the Klan believed. He actually was a great friend to Black Americans. He joined Brown versus Board of Education, a great friend of immigrants and Catholics and Jews. The Klan is very anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, as well as anti-Black. So he was, and people can grow and get better. And at the very, very end, he became a little, cranky. But he is the driving intellectual force of the Warren Court. The Warren Court did 6 things, and Hugo Black was at the heart of all 6, way before Earl Warren and Brennan joined the court. Here's what the Warren Court did. Get rid of Jim Crow, American apartheid. Get rid of organized prayer in the public schools because it's not religiously equal. People are different religions, and government shouldn't privilege this one over that one. Apply the Bill of Rights against the states. This is huge. Think about a case involving liberty. It's not actually, you think it's a Bill of Rights case, it's not. It involves a state or locality. It involves Lawrence versus Texas, or Miranda versus Arizona, or Griswold versus Connecticut. Hugo Black applied all these amendments, speech, press, petition, assembly, free exercise, search and seizure, against states and localities. That's epic. That's his idea more than anyone else's of his era. One person, one vote, protecting voting rights. Also a Warren Court theme, Hugo Black idea. Criminal defendants have rights, even indigent criminal defendants, like a right to a lawyer. That's Gideon versus Wainwright. So these are Hugo Black ideas. It's what the Warren Court basically did. And broad protection of political speech. Hugo Black is championing these ideas before Warren and Brennan are on the court. And he is, not because he's a good man, although I think he was a good man, but he read this again and again and again. He says, it actually says free speech. It does. It actually says equal. It does. It actually says states have to follow protect fundamental rights. It really does. So he took the text seriously, and he didn't go to a fancy school. He went to University of Alabama for 2 years. He's like Abraham Lincoln, like out of a field of dreams, cornfield, just sort of popping up in the middle of America. He had a library card and a portable typewriter, and every evening he went to the Library of Congress and read something, and then read something more, and then read something more. And Scalia didn't do that. Okay, he didn't, even though he's had fancier educational credentials. But Hugo Black actually did the work. And I never heard of Hugo Black when I arrived in law school.
Mr. Meyer, I agree with you that the federal Constitution binds the country together. And I was wondering, I know Connecticut is the Constitution state. It's even on our license plates that all 50 states and the District of Columbia, and many of their decisions, they refer to Connecticut ruling.
Yes.
But I wanted to ask this question here. I see you have a great background in school and academic, but have you ever taken a case through litigation, through the Superior Court, and then through the appellate, then through the state Supreme Court, and then through the appealing it in the federal court in New York City, and then appealing it to the federal court in Washington? Because it's very easy to read a book or to go to law school. But when you,
it's not that easy to go to law school.
Well, I mean, I've been in court for over 30 years, and you know about predatory lending. We're $14 trillion in bank.
Okay, I got the question, so I'll blow your mind.
The bank, okay.
I got the question.
Okay, so I've been in court, and I have never, of the 5,000 lawyers I've ever heard one lawyer ever even mentioned that the Constitution exists, never mind upholding what is in the Constitution.
Okay.
I got the question, so I'm going to blow your mind. I'm not a lawyer. Never even took the bar. Do not take money from clients. Well, you're throwing your hands up like that, but you asked the question, now let other people ask theirs, and let me answer your question with all due respect. Okay, I don't take money from people to make legal arguments. I call it as I see it as a scholar. Now here's what I do. I file amicus briefs in the United States Supreme Court as a scholar. I'm sometimes joined by other scholars, and because I don't take money from this side or that side, and I'm just telling you what I actually honestly think the Constitution means, I'm hopeful that the justices will pay attention to my expertise. Now, here's what I can tell you, because I'm not modest, but I am honest. You say it's easy to go to law school? Try doing it, okay?
Sir, we're okay.
No.
I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry.
No,
I'm sorry.
no, people did not, with all due respect, they didn't come to hear you, they came to hear me, okay? And I came a long way to be here, you were heard, okay? So,
Go ahead.
it's not so easy to do really well in law school because there are a lot of other smart people around, and this is why I admire the justices, because they all did well in law school and they could have made $1 gazillion, and they're choosing to serve the rest of us. So here's what I expect from the justices. Here's what I expect from myself. I don't write about my politics, and I don't take money from clients. I'm trying to be an expert on the history and the law and the text. Then I write up what I think I found in books, and you can read them and decide for yourself, and file briefs in the Supreme Court. I never take a dime for this. I sometimes pay out of my own pocket to share with the justices what I think I've learned, and here's what I want them to do: read the briefs. And they didn't, actually, in some of these cases, and I'm annoyed. Here's what I can tell you, and I'm not modest, but it's true. I've been cited more by the United States Supreme Court than any other living person under the age of 80. And I'm cited across the spectrum by the conservatives and the liberals. There are two people who are cited more. There's Larry Tribe, he's in his 80s, and there's a guy named Wayne LaFave, he's in his 90s, okay? So this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be an honest scholar who writes not about my politics, but what the Constitution really does say. So that's my job. Now here's your job. You have to read what I said, because you're citizens. You pick presidents. You're the hiring committee, and the first thing he or she is going to have to do is to swear to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And you can't do your damn job if you don't know what the Constitution says and doesn't say. If you were trying to pick a center fielder for the Yankees or the Dodgers or whatever, you need to know what a center fielder does. You would. Okay? So that's my burden to you. That's why I said, when you asked 3 questions, I said, well, if you're an office holder, you've taken an oath to it. If you're a citizen, it's what binds you to each other. And the justices, they don't have to agree with me, but they have to do their homework, and Scalia didn't and Black did. And that's what I'm telling you, So my job is to tell you what I actually think the honest answer is. Their job, at the end of the day, they're going to hear from other experts as well, and then umpire the thing. That's how, but you have a role. You are the hiring committee for the president, and the presidency is, presidents pick justices. Justices aren't supposed to pick presidents. I just told you in one sentence why Bush versus Gore was a pile of poo. Justices aren't supposed to pick presidents. Presidents are supposed to pick justices.
Hi.
Professor, thank you. Thank you for coming by. How did Madison become the father of the Constitution?
Brilliant. Because he created a political party with Jefferson, and that political party had it in their interest to tout these people. So who's up there on Rushmore? Washington, who was pre-party and above party, and then the founders of our 2 great political parties. Jefferson is the founder of modern-day Democrats. Lincoln is the founder of modern-day Republicans. Ours is a party system. Someone's going to have to basically sing your song, and the song of Madison and Jefferson is being sung by their political party, which becomes the party of Jackson, which is the dominant political party in America until Abe Lincoln. So there's a world before parties, and then it's actually Jefferson and Madison's party that becomes Jackson's party, which is dominant, and then it's Lincoln's party, which is dominant all the way to Franklin Roosevelt, and then it's Roosevelt's party, which is dominant all the way until Ronald Reagan, and we're living in a world in which Reagan's party is still really, I think, the dominant party.
And Madison has his notes, so we see later on.
Oh, yeah, he lives longer than everyone else, and after they're all dead, he publishes his version of what happened, and oh, it just turns out that he was the star of the play. And truthfully, I think he actually was. I think the notes there, he does rewrite them multiple times, and this is criticized in an important book by Mary Sarah Bilder. She wins the Bancroft for the book. It's called Madison's Hand, but he does outlive the others. And he does become president, a two-term president, and he hands off power to his wingman. It's very hard to actually, win 2 terms and hand off power. Ronald Reagan did it, but not so. The last time the Democrats did it, Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. Okay, this is not an easy thing to do.
Hi.
Hi, good evening, Professor Amar. I was wondering, as it relates to the recent protests on college campuses, should public universities be able to prohibit expression that may be considered harmful to specific groups, and to what extent?
Well, that's huge. I think the government has to allow very broad free speech, even stuff that people don't like to hear. I'm an old-fashioned person who believes that the best antidote to harmful and hateful speech is more speech in general, and I draw the line at imminent threats to physical threats to people basically right in front of you. But you get to say, if you want to, in a university, all sorts of nasty things about brown-skinned people, or about children of immigrants. I'm both. You get to say all that, and I get to respond to you with my words. And that's what we do, especially in universities, and that's what we do in America. And people who say nasty things should be criticized. We should not hold them in high regard, but the government should not try to prevent them from saying nasty things. That's what the First Amendment's all about.
Akhil, I think we're just about done. But along those lines, briefly, if you could, social media. We talked about the university, but constitutionally, can the government prohibit a social media company from promoting something or ideas that they, in its view, is harmful? Is that constitutional?
In general, people get to say what they want on broadcast media, in print media, on social media. Now, we do have libel laws, so if you say false things and maliciously false things and knowingly false things, someone can sue you. And Rudy Giuliani got sued for everything he has because he said false things. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. This fellow who denied the reality of the Newtown massacre, Alex Jones, something like that. Well, he got sued for so we have rules. But here's what's virtually sacrosanct: expressions of political and religious opinion. You get to express them. And religious people, their expressions of religious opinion can be very harmful. In that, if you believe that you have a religious truth, you think the other religions, are wrong. And so if you're Martin Luther, you say some things that aren't very nice about the Catholic Church. You do, because that's what it means to be, a Protestant. A protester against the Catholic Church. So we have to protect. It's really important to protect broad freedom of political opinion. That has to be virtually sacrosanct. Intentional lies, actually, from the get-go, have been subject to certain kinds of punishment, especially with libel laws, civil libel laws. If you say something knowingly false about me, and I'm just a private citizen. Now, if you're a government official, we cut you a lot more slack. if you're criticizing a government official, excuse me, then we cut you a lot more slack. But if you just criticize your next door neighbor and you say they're a child molester or something, and they're not, and you know that they're not, and you just made that up, they can sue you, and that's been true since before the First Amendment.
And it seems to me that the very essence of freedom of speech was to be able to criticize the government. It seems like that.
Absolutely, which is why a great case, and you have been taught it's a First Amendment case, but technically it's not, because it involves a state. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. This is Hugo Black. He applies these principles of free speech and free press against states and localities. I call that incorporation of the big Bill of Rights. It's a very big idea. Perhaps the most famous free speech case, or one of the 3 or 4 most famous in our tradition, is a case called New York Times v. Sullivan. And in New York Times versus Sullivan, people took out an ad in the New York Times to criticize white Southern officials in Alabama who were clamping down on the civil rights movement. And they said things that actually were technically untrue. They said the protesters sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee" when they really sang the Star-Spangled Banner or something like that. And they said the cops ringed the campus, the protesters, but they didn't quite close the circle. So there were some technical falsehoods here. But what the court said is none of this was malicious. You get to criticize government officials very robustly. In America, you know, you have what we need is there's an absolute right against states and localities, and not just against the federal government. And this is Hugo Black. This is the Warren Court to the expression, robust and uninhibited, you know, wide open criticism of government, even if it's at times caustic. You know, we are a rude people, we Americans. You know, we are. We don't have maybe the manners of some other places, but that's part of who we are. And when you're criticizing government officials, we have to give you a very, very strong measure of protection. Because, and here's why, they work for us. That's why they're public servants. We pay them. In America, we the people are sovereign. They are our servants, and we get to criticize John Adams. We do. He didn't understand that. He tried to make it a crime to criticize John Adams, and that's why he got booted from office, rightly so. He's the only early president who was ousted from office. Washington, 2 terms, then steps down. Jefferson, 2 terms and steps down. Madison, 2 terms and steps down. Monroe, 2 terms and steps down. Then Adams' son, he loses his bid for re-election. And Andrew Jackson, 2 terms and steps down. And why is John Adams the exception? Because he tried to shut down criticism of himself, and you can't do that in America. Americans have a need to have a very robust right to criticize officials, whether that's George III or George III's ministers, or once we have a constitution in place, even the President of the United States.
Professor Amar's book is for sale, by the way, if anybody's interested. I strongly recommend it if you want a brilliant look at the Constitution and its writing and the journey we took. It is absolutely fantastic. In fact, Akhil had asked me if he thought perhaps it might be too long. I didn't think it was long enough. It was absolutely brilliant. I want to thank the Westport Library, and I want to thank Professor Amar for being here tonight.